And then she said, "Don't you understand what we're trying to do here? We're trying to support these young women."
The 2010 documentary, W.A.R. Women, Art, Revolution, written, edited, and directed by Lynn Hirschman Leeson, is something I hope you can legally watch without giving this project a penny of your money. Maybe check it out from a library, or borrow a copy from your friendly neighborhood feminist art theory professor. In my first draft of this script, I was scared I would face false copyright flags if I shared any actual clips from this documentary. I was going to focus on just the ideas being expressed about revolutionary feminism. Upon reflection, I decided that it's almost impossible to appreciate what feminist art is and what it's trying to accomplish without showing examples of it. So I will be showing very brief clips from the documentary so that you can have a mental picture of the work I'm talking about. The documentary's name is an homage to a group formed in the 1960s with the same acronym, but the group's name stands for Women Artists in Revolution. In this review, I'm going to use the name W.A.R. to refer to the documentary, and use the full name when referring to the group. This documentary includes multiple interviews, which are edited and arranged according to topic. In my previous videos on feminism and art, which focused on the anthology Visibly Female, I tried to give more than just a brief overview and tried to summarize the full argument of those essays. Because I think it'd be impractical to give you a thorough summary of a documentary, I'm just going to give you a more brief overview, in addition to my thoughts on why this movie is important. During my time as an art student, this was shown to first-year students as a key introduction to feminist theory. The opening scenes paint a picture of a misogynistic art world, creating a need for a revolutionary political response from feminists. The speakers accuse art history books, art classrooms, and museums of either denigrating women artists, ignoring them, or actively censoring them. To add support to this idea, they conduct interviews with random individuals on the street who cannot name 3 women artists. The film is peppered with slides of artworks by women artists, which Lynn Hirschman Leeson claims you have been prevented from seeing. She suggests that the reason you may not be aware of the art featured in this documentary is that the art establishment purposefully marginalizes women. Are you an art historian? How dare you not be writing about the artists and artworks Hirschman Leeson thinks you ought to be writing about? She calls the story of radical feminist art an insistent history which refuses to wait any longer to be told. She is using a high, soaring rhetoric. To the young person in art class being exposed to this documentary in a positive light, Hirschman Leeson's words are a call to action. Hirschman Leeson tells us about the state of the world around the time she left Berkeley as a radicalized student. She rewinds to 1968, and without directly condoning the Black Panthers, mentions them alongside civil rights and free speech movements and footage of Martin Luther King Jr. This creates the distinct impression that the Black Panthers were a civil rights and free speech movement. This introduction is not the only point in the movie where the Black Panthers are portrayed as an inspiration for the radical feminist politics W.A.R. is celebrating, mentioning how famed feminist artist Judy Chicago chose to change her last name to Chicago because of the Black Panthers.
So we adapted the forms of the Black Panthers before we developed our own forms. No, it's absolutely true. When I didn't feel like I had a name, and I wanted to make some statement, some kind of symbolic statement about the fact that I was taking control of my own destiny. I was fighting it out pretty much alone and isolated.
Wow, Judy, that's very woke indeed. Too bad your most famous art project looks so transphobic in current year because it uses vaginas to represent women. Hirschman Leeson says this about art after 1968. It was at that precarious moment in history that art and politics fused and then transfused into the blocked cultural arteries of the time. Remember the slogan, "The personal is political"? These two sentiments overlap with one another. This film explains why these artists believed their art had to embrace radical politics as the content and goal of their art. The next few interviews involve stories where women claim they had sexist encounters with individuals in the art world, and suggest that the art world, as a whole, has a problem with racism and sexism. Now, as I show you samples of the art featured in this documentary, here is one question I think is important to keep in mind. Is there any possible explanation other than sexism and racism why this art might not have been popular choices to feature in museums and galleries, or financially successful amongst patrons of the arts? Is the only possible explanation a hatred of women, or could the art museums, galleries, and collectors have had other reasons for not caring for some of the art we will see in this documentary? Curator Howard Fox and painter Judith Baca are interviewed to provide some context on the art which was popular in museums and schools in the late 1960s, minimalist art like silhouettes. In contrast to a radical feminist art, abstract expressionism and minimalist art seems very non-political. I believe that feminist art is the most important art movement of the 20th century because, as a reaction against apolitical minimalist art, feminist art helped reintroduce the idea of political, personal, and cultural topics into art again. Say what you will about some of this art, it's not boring. It's not purposefully devoid of content. To illustrate the tension between feminist art and minimalist art, Hirschman Leeson includes a clip of a feminist performance artwork, Please Sing Along, featuring Nancy Buchanan and Barbara T. Smith. One woman represents minimalism, and one represents feminism, and as they fight, the man in the background is reciting quotes about minimalist art theory.
Feminism may, in fact, be the most successful part, must completely on its self-conscious stage of the positivistic domination of the art world.
The documentary then transitions to 1970, when Robert Rauschenberg and Carl Andre, along with other prominent male artists, planned to protest major museum and gallery shows in protest against the invasion of Cambodia. Rauschenberg and Andre were included in a protest show called the Biennale in Exile, but only men's work was included in this protest show. Feminist artist Faith Reingold laughs as she reminisces about how she participated in an effort to shut down this show if it wasn't integrated.
Well, we just got mad and we said, we're mad, we're not taking it anymore.
The camera briefly shows a list of demands covered over in red handwriting. I found a reference to the text of these demands, and since these are not touched on in the documentary, I want to read these to you. And I want you to imagine the experience of opening this up and reading these demands, covered over in scrawled red handwriting. The Manifesto of W.S.A.B.A.L., Women Students and Artists for Black Art Liberation, a student organization of black art workers, 1970, by Michelle Wallace. The functions of WSABL: to inform the student public of the aesthetic oppression of black women in the visual arts. The aesthetic oppression comes in the forms of brown art shows filled with token art which are being passed off for black art shows, anti-human art shows which are being passed off for protest shows, the exclusion of black women artists from all art shows because of their position as the only generation which is creating a revolution in art. So what's of note here is they are identifying a revolution in art as being what is excluded. To encourage all students to protest and challenge all trends against art for people. WSABL has done this most recently in the cases of letters to the New York Times in response to articles written by Hilton Kramer, Uncle Benny Andrews, and Edmund Gaither concerning the show Afro-American Artists, New York and Boston, which intentionally excluded black women for the purpose of leading the public to believe that the brown shit art done by black male artists was black art, and for the purpose of projecting particular token art which do not threaten the anti-human art establishment. So they are calling Benny Andrews a Uncle Tom, and they are calling black male artists brown shit art. A commitment which was expressed in a letter to Edmund Gaither, the organizer of the Boston Brown Shit Art Show, to actively oppose all brown art shows which are meant to oppose all real art in the future. So, if you haven't picked this up yet, what I want to make clear is that they particularly want black women artists who are concerned with the Afro-American situation of today, meaning art of a particular political persuasion. If you are a black woman artist who paints beautiful paintings, that's not what's of concern to them. What's of concern to them, remember they called black male artists Uncle Tom artists earlier. What is concerned to them is the true art, the art which is not anti-human, the revolution in art. We supply the black women with the liberated voice to protest bigotry on the part of black and white male artists against black women artists. We are destroying the walls that separate the art of black women from the view of the people by exposing so-called black art shows as brown shit art shows and so-called protest shows as anti-human art superstar shows. Black art is not all brown shit or all male. Picture art. Political propaganda or prediction of the future. Black art talk. We don't talk it, we do it. Token beep art. Mainstream copy whitey art. All shows are to be 50% women. All shows which are not a stated projection of a particular cultural group, such as Afro-American, American Indians, American whites, etc., must reflect the ethnic distribution of the metropolitan area in which the show is being given. I think it's remarkable that they recognize the possibility of an American white show as a viable option. Wasaball's primary interest is in the oppression of black women artists by Michelle Wallace, art writer, Wasaball, Harlem, New York. Now, the only bit of this screed that they chose to highlight was all shows are to be 50% women. Was there anything else you heard here that made it seem like the art they're talking about might be a little off the beaten track, maybe a little odd to include in a show of painting, like rejecting picture art? Do these sound like the kind of charming people that you just cannot wait to have an art show with so that they can tell all the black male artists that they're brown shit art? What I think is key to remember about this dispute is that there was a political purpose to this exhibit. They were against the invasion of Cambodia. It wasn't open for just anybody and their pro-Nixon cat. If women were not being included in a show of work by Robert and his friends, one possible theory is that Robert and his friends wanted to exclude women for being women, that they were misogynists who wanted a Calvin and Hobbes style club with no slimy girls allowed. Another possibility is that this show was already for an exclusive progressive club of like-minded famous painters, that the reason radical feminist performance art or anti-brown shit art was not included was a matter of taste about the content of the art, not the sex of the creators. My point is that even straight white male painters had plenty of obstacles in place to keep them from being included in an anti-war show, along with Robert Rauschenberg and Carl Andre. I'm sure a lot of straight white male artists would have loved to show their regionalist paintings alongside world-famous artists like Rauschenberg and Andre, but the reality is that there are impassable barriers in place which don't make that realistic for just any old artist. Faith Reingold didn't merely express an opinion that some women artists should have been included in Rauschenberg and Andre's anti-war art show. She and her compatriots demanded a quota of 50% women artist representation under threat of a shutdown. When you demand a quota based on your sex and call black male artists brown shit artists and mainstream progressive artists anti-human artists, you are demanding that your art should not be evaluated based only on the merits of the art itself. Faith Reingold wasn't one of Robert Rauschenberg's best buddies who he promised to include in an art show until he realized, to his horror, that she had secretly been a woman all along. What the documentary tells us is that Faith Reingold is someone who just randomly showed up to the show after it was already up, saw there were no women artists, got outraged, and then joined in with this group who sent a list of demands with crazy handwritten scrawls laced with the N-word and calling people brown shit and anti-human artists. I don't know about you, but there is nothing quite like threatening to shut down my art show to convince me that you are just the sort of person I'd love to have included in my artistic social circles. We'll have some cheese and crackers with wine, reminisce about that one time you sent me that list of demands with the N-word all over them, load of laughs. I would almost feel sorry for Robert Rauschenberg if I were not so busy with all this popcorn. SJWs have been eating each other since the good old Richard Nixon days.
That group was actually just me and my daughter Michelle Wallace. Those were the days when two people could raise a lot of hell. and make everybody think we were 35,000 people, you know what I mean?
What Faith is describing here is today called Twitter. Around that same time, other groups of feminists picketed the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C., and the Whitney in New York. In all of these examples, they are objecting to shows which only feature male artists and are using various tactics to shame or pressure these museums and galleries to have 50% female representation.
It was a sculpture annual, and people said, oh, there are no women who make sculpture, the usual silly business. We did a big demonstration around the Whitney Annual. We picketed every Saturday. We faked a press release that went out to all the media on Whitney Stationery saying that the Whitney was so pleased to be the first museum to acknowledge that women artists have been neglected and have 50% women and 50% non-whites.
Notice how proud she is of this. They used a completely deceptive tactic. They also demanded that 50% of the artists be non-white. And according to the documentary, they put eggs in the museum. Lynn Hirschman Leeson includes footage of smashed eggs, so I do not know if this means that they actually smashed eggs indoors as a form of protest or just set their eggs down indoors. Whatever it was, Faith Reingold tells us that people were outraged. Well, I think that is understandable. After telling the story of more feminist art programs and protests, they transitioned to 1970 and the opening of Judy Chicago's Woman Art Program in Fresno, California.
I remember asking my students how many of them had been raped and being just totally shocked when like a quarter or half of them raised their hands. And it was all discovery about what our true experiences had been.
Feeling that male artists were already overrepresented in other programs, Judy Chicago insisted that her students learn only about women's art. Chicago's students produced such masterpieces as Cock and Cunt Play.
Most women knew how to act out even if they didn't have any experience performing. They were experienced at performing roles in society.
Will you help me do the dishes?
Help you do the dishes?
Well, they're your dishes as much as mine.
But you don't have a...
This is misandrist garbage, and I am so happy that feminists are finally getting wrecked and called TERFs for decades of this open hatred and stupidity. This is what art looks like when you reject capitalism and make political expression your idol, instead of creating beautiful works and learning productive and useful skills. In terms of making an economic decision, these students wasted their time and their money. I want to emphasize that this documentary is not just talking about women artists being shown. It's not just a simple matter that they want some women artists to be able to have their work exhibited. They want this kind of work exhibited. They began creating feminist consciousness-raising groups, and some of them were shocked, I tell you, to discover that some of their peers in these groups might express a hatred for men.
I think I was very scared by the anger all of them were expressing and the rage, and I was very recently married, and I was feeling very conflictual about, how one had to suddenly be angry about men.
Naturally, as a result, I had to leave my husband, as so many of us did.
And it was the luckiest day of his life. These groups essentially functioned as a spark for new directions. Feminist artists now had a network they could communicate with. In an interview, Harmony Hammond claims that these feminist groups gave them a chance to talk about art in a way the boys didn't talk about art, focusing on content. My observation is that there is some substance to this if you take into account the popularity of minimalist art. If the popular art of the day is deliberately apolitical and devoid of content, then by contrast, feminist art is loaded with content. Dr. Arlene Raven describes her experience at this time.
I stopped doing the dishes, making the 3 meals a day, the laundry and the house cleaning and so on. The process of personal liberation for me resulted in the breakup of my marriage. So that was my first introduction to feminism. And there was a second stage of that in which right after, a few days after I left my marriage, I was raped. And that experience was highly politicizing for me.
Note that to Dr. Raven, her rape was a politicizing experience.
And I became very strongly connected to the fact that I wanted all of my energy, my professional energies, my personal energies, my political energies, to be integrated in the struggle for women's liberation.
Do you hear the commitment that's being expressed here? She's devoting her life to this. They transition from talking about rape as a political issue for feminists to The Semiotics of the Kitchen by Martha Rossler. This is one of my favorite works of feminist art of all time. I love watching the video. Hearing Rossler describe the work in her interview only makes it better. She was concerned with the utilitarian domesticity of these household objects. The reason she is banging these objects together is she sees a kind of cultural idea encoded in them to domesticate women. Rossler says that she enjoyed finding out that men found this performance frightening. Maybe the men in Rossler's day found Semiotics of the Kitchen threatening, but as for me...
Chopper.
To review, students are being taught about the kind of work we're seeing as a form of inspiration. They are proud of this fact.
Elsewhere. So we got married. This day I have to get a lot of my work. So in January, but I just felt that it was fashion. So I was like the best mother you could possibly be, the best house. I never seemed to have more than 20 minutes at a time for myself. And slowly.
Eleanor Anton tells us the story of role-playing as a man.
I was interested what would my male self, naturally, as I've told you, I'm vain.
You don't say.
So I wanted to be the most handsomest male self, and in my tape I discovered I was a king with my small face. But a king has to have a kingdom, so I went out into the world and conversed with my people, citizens of Solana Beach.
I did not add this soundtrack. Lynn Hirschman Leeson clearly thought that this was the perfect music to accompany Eleanor Anton, telling us she put on a beard, pretended to be the king of Solana Beach, and walking around to speak to her subjects. Oh, great artistic choice, Leeson. That's the perfect musical accompaniment. After Lynn Hirschman Leeson wrestled with whether or not to include her own work in her film, she decided she would. Her art project involved creating a fake identity, Roberta. She saw a psychiatrist, opened a bank account, put out personal ads in the newspaper for roommates, all under a false name and false guise. Why did she do this?
Roberta was my own flipped effigy. She was a mirror of culture. So we made art in which we created identities, even fictional histories, which were better than none at all. The personal became the political, and the very personal became art.
The personal is political. They believe in this. This is their gospel. In addition to many artists role-playing as various characters, like Anna Mendietta's Chicken Lady here, race became a more explicit theme of some feminist art. Take a sip of scotch every time Adrian Piper blinks in this performance.
For example, It's our problem if you feel that I'm making an unnecessary fuss about my racial identity, if you don't see why I have to announce it this way. Well, if you feel that my letting people know I'm not white is making an unnecessary fuss, you must feel that the right and proper course of action for me to take is to pass for white.
Please don't take a sip of scotch every time Adrian Piper blinks in that performance. You'll die of alcohol poisoning. I feel like I shouldn't have to say that, but we live in the age of kids eating Tide Pods after all. Howardina Pindell tells a story of experiencing racism as a child, and I think the application she makes to her art is fascinating because it effectively illustrates how there is an emotional basis rooted in her life experience for why she hates and rejects Western art and symbols. After telling the story of how one of her childhood teachers believed that whites and blacks should not share a bathroom and being tied up by her teacher during bathroom time so she would not be able to use the same bathroom as her white classmates, Pindell tells us that she created work role-playing both herself and her teacher. Her portrayal of the white teacher isn't just a recreation of her experience. Effectively, this character is her straw man that she's using as part of her feminist critique of art. If you are asking, it's terrible that your teacher did that to you, but why are you putting on white nylons over your head and talking about racism with skewed sunglasses almost falling off your nose in an acute angle and calling that your professional work as an artist? Because she rejects Western symbols.
You know, we don't believe in your symbols. You must use our symbols. They're not valid unless we validate them. You really must be paranoid. I've never had an experience like that, but then of course I'm free, white, and 21.
I don't disbelieve Howardina Pindell's story, but I don't excuse her for letting that experience, that wicked thing her teacher did to her, define her life to the point that she could express such blatant bigotry in her art.
People were offended by it, were very angry about it.
People were offended by it? Of course they were. Open, strident bigotry based on race is offensive. You don't think that's what you're doing because of your lens, but by weaponizing your life experience, you've made a work that defeats itself. Your straw man white character calls you paranoid. Do you think that the only reason someone might accuse you of paranoia is because they are a white racist perpetuating patriarchy? Or might the fact that you wear a white nylon over your face with your sunglasses falling off, talking to yourself, have something to do with why people might associate the word paranoid with you?
CalArts in 1972, I showed photographs of myself dressing as a man trying to look like a woman, photographs using makeup to beautify and then to deform my face. And then Judy said, well, what do you think of the work that you see here? And there were flowers and breasts all over the walls, and I thought it was hideous. So I said, it looks prescriptive to me. And then she said, don't you understand what we're trying to do here? We're trying to support these young women.
You mean to tell me that you did not like the flowers and breast feminist art, and Judy Chicago yelled at you, insinuating that you didn't understand the importance of feminist art to women? No, I don't believe it. You'd think I'd believe for a second that a famous, iconic feminist artist, the founder of the first feminist art program in the country, mind you, would have an emotional reaction to a perfectly tame comment and make such unfounded accusations impugning your motive? Not for 1 second would I believe that.
So I started crying. I completely lost it and just, I couldn't believe that a feminist could act like this.
Martha Wilson is about this close to becoming my favorite MRA ever. Yes, Martha, feminists, professional, iconic, famous feminist art luminaries are capable of toxic and emotionally abusive behavior over little nothings. Now remember that experience and imagine if any young men may have had a similar experience to you with Judy Chicago or the generations that followed her.
And to this day, I haven't forgiven Judy Chicago for making me cry.
Here is Judy Chicago, in her own words, describing a problem she sees in progressive art circles. She mentions reading Marx, Chairman Mao, and Lenin as key texts in these groups.
In China, they have study groups, they have consciousness-raising groups. They read theory, they read Mao, they read Marx, they read Lenin. It's like you say, how do I make change? And we tell you, and you say, oh, I don't want to do all that. That won't make change. And we say to you, those of us who are effectively making change are not ignorant. Those people who have ever made change in the history of the human race were not ignorant, and nobody who's ignorant will ever make change.
The documentary doesn't provide us enough context to know exactly who she is talking about, but she seems to be upset about a group of well-read Marxist, politically active leftists who do not believe that cultural change is possible. She's angry about this lack of vision.
That is one of the reasons women are not able to translate their aspirations into reality, because they are embedded in remaining ignorant. And it pisses me off.
You can see how an art program hosted by this person would have deep problems. Miriam Shapiro hints vaguely at what these problems might be, but whatever the heck happened, she euphemizes it. Shapiro says that Judy locked the door of the program, leading a lot of people to get upset. I take this to mean that Judy Chicago locked students and teachers out of something as a kind of statement or act of retaliation. I don't know the details at this point, but I am dead interested in knowing what the heck Judy Chicago did at CalArts. Here is an iconic figure in the history of feminist art, and the picture we're being painted of her program is more than fulfilling the worst stereotypes of immature girls emotionally bullying one another as a form of alpha girl competition. In 1972, Chicago, Shapiro, and others transformed a vacant Los Angeles house into a massive feminist artwork, Woman House. I'm sure I will return to Woman House in the future. I had to read exhaustively wordy essays analyzing this art project. In the footage, sure enough, we see breasts and symbolic breasts on the wall. By the way, great parenting job, you, bringing your 5-year-old to see Woman House. I'm sure seeing all those boobies really deprogrammed the patriarchy right out of that kid. Dr. Raven recalls that when she began teaching, Chicago and Shapiro were not speaking to each other. More evidence that the utopian sisterhood is struggling to keep from devolving into a Mean Girls-style high school scene. After describing Woman House as a kind of finale for the movement, Dr. Raven recalls their plans to create brochures with photographs of them in trash cans, throwing out old art and replacing it with feminist art. Raven jokes about that being a bad idea and laughs it off, but I want to call your attention to the fact that these feminist artists considered photographing themselves throwing away old art, Western art, and replacing it with feminist art, using photos of themselves in trash cans. She thought that would be a good idea, a good representation of what they were aiming to accomplish. I really wish this brochure idea had happened. It'd be nice to have a visual aid when I make the point that a stated goal of major feminist artists is the replacement of Western art with avant-garde feminist performance art. Arlene Raven, Sheila de Bretteville, and Judy Chicago left CalArts and started the Feminist Studio Workshop. In 1973, they founded the Women's Building. De Bretteville was interviewed twice about her involvement with the Women's Building, in 1990 and 2008, and these two interviews are spliced together. Her 2008 interview is quite emotionally laden, and I think she offers a perspective on a problem this feminist movement had. Fixating on the lack of money and institutional support and raging against the establishment rather than empathizing with others who did not have financial success. I think there is something prescient about de Bretteville's perspective. She sees a problem with a lack of empathy in academic feminist art, which she thinks inhibited the movement. However, even while trying to call for empathy, I can't help but think that this entire complaint about lack of money for academic feminist art is pretty much first world problems personified. Of course, museums and gallery directors were not chomping at the bit to buy as much feminist art as fast as they could. You were deliberately making avant-garde work that is purposely supposed to be pushing the barriers of what is acceptable. What she is crying about is how they didn't have enough money to make more and more ambitious avant-garde feminist art. Part of my problem with this documentary is it is somewhat meandering. After a few introductory sections highlighting some of the basics of what feminist art is about and what these various feminists were trying to accomplish, we focused on the first feminist art programs, Woman House and the Woman's Building. Leeson suggests that these ideas began to spread until they became a body politic. In other words, enough feminist artists found each other that they weren't a scattered group of individuals surrounded by minimalist painters anymore. Leeson does a play on words. Not only were feminists affecting the body politic, they were literally using the body as part of their political art. This section touches on male gaze theory. Why do feminists engage in avant-garde performance art? Why don't they make classical paintings representing a feminist vision for the world? Because they see performance art as a rejection of male gaze. You can go look at a woman in a painting in a museum, but a feminist performance artist can look back at you. Art historian Dr. Moira Roth describes Martha Rosler's performance, Vital Statistics of a Citizen, Simply Obtained, as an example of this rejection of male gaze. I can't show you much of Rosler's performance on YouTube. She is stripped naked, and you can see everything. Say parents, did you know this documentary is a popular choice to show your 18-year-olds in their first feminist art class? Just so you know. Maybe the next time their school asks you for donations, you can ask if your little freshman got to see Martha Rosler take it all off to improve their understanding of the gravity of feminist art. I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's clear to me that Rosler is using being stripped and measured as a kind of shocking, ham-fisted metaphor for male gaze and the objectification of women's bodies. Naked photographs of Eleanor Antin, taken as a part of her project, Carving, a traditional sculpture, are also shown in their full frontal glory. I can't show you these on YouTube either, but don't be deceived by the title. It's not a traditional sculpture. It's photographs of Antin, standing with straight posture, rotating at different angles so you can see a 360-degree view. Using the F word, she describes how she was afraid no one would take her work seriously because she was so effing obviously a woman.
And I was shaking. And I said, oh my God, they're not going to take me seriously. I'm so obviously a woman. And I remember going outside and taking a walk and saying, well, that's me.
What a charming person. Is it possible that there was any other reason a person might not take you seriously other than you being a woman? If you want my take on what the title means, the reason this is titled Carving a Traditional Sculpture is it is also meant to be a critique of Western ideas about art and beauty. For example, the Venus de Milo is an idealized representation of a female form. Antin is saying F you to this idea of sculpture by photographing her nude body in a dull posture and presenting that as a sculpture. That's my personal interpretation on what's going on in this work. Ana Mendietta's work is cited as an example of the female body in art being represented as ephemeral and fragile. Nancy Spiro interprets Mendietta's work as both a personal and political statement on violence against women. Of all these artists, Mendietta's is one of the few I find beautiful, and it seems ironic to me that the beauty of this work essentially comes from it recognizing a politically incorrect reality. Women tend to come off worse than men in violent encounters because women's bodies significantly differ from men as a matter of biological reality. Barbara T. Smith tells the story of doing a work where she would stand in a bathroom naked, but a rumor went around that she would make love to any guy who came into the room. Now, here's what I can't figure out about this project, even after going to read articles about it. Did she actually comply with men who entered the room to make love to her, or was this just a rumor? Everything I've read is somewhat ambiguous about it, but more than one source suggests that she accepted sexual intercourse from any man who wanted it as a type of feeding. I provided links to 2 articles which suggest as much in the description below. Understandably, this provoked some feminist outrage. Smith is allegedly making herself sexually available to men she does not know as part of her art. Smith argues that her piece was severely misunderstood, that artists like Yoko Ono and Marina Abramovic had done performance art pieces where they allowed themselves to actually be victimized by the audience as part of an art project. What I understand Smith's argument to be is that feminists complaining that she allowed herself to be victimized by men are misunderstanding her intent. Given that she contrasts her piece with Yoko Ono and Marina Abramovic, I take this to mean that Smith consented to any sexual intercourse which may or may not have taken place during Feed Me. Her story illustrates a key reason I wanted to make videos on this topic. In defending her work of performance art, Smith alludes to performance projects where women allowed themselves to be taken advantage of as the whole purpose of their piece. When a young, impressionable feminist art student is asked to make feminist art, this is the kind of work they are being shown as examples of important works of art. Very few students are going to have the chutzpah to actually do something this dangerous. But when you show this film as an example of wonderful feminist art that should be imitated, the implication for students is clear. They are taught to make work which is personal, pushes the boundaries, and responds to this kind of work. An impressionable student is being taught that Barbara T. Smith, who presumably did make herself sexually available to strangers in a restroom for her art project as a way of sending a pro-feminist message, is being held up to young people as an example of an artist making important art. Parents, were your children shown this documentary in art school? You bet my buttons I was surprised when I was shown this documentary as a first-year student. I don't know what I can even say about Yvonne Rainer that isn't expressed in this clip.
The women's movement gave me permission to start moving into my experiences as a woman. And it was a series of gestures that went. And that act of covering that part of the body, touching oneself there. As far as I knew, no one had ever done that before. And in fact, the friend of mine, a dancer, said when she saw that, she gasped.
Sorry, gang, if you don't get it, I'm coming up empty here. At this point, the cringe really comes hard and fast. I could just quote B. Ruby Rich's words on the female body in feminist performance art to make my point, but I want you to see how excited she is while she says this.
Instead of the female body being the enemy of an artist or the muse for an artist, suddenly it really became not just the stuff of work, but the tool of work.
The body in performance art is seen as a renunciation of the body in Western art. Rather than being a subject of a male artist's vision or the male gaze of a client, feminist performance art makes the body the actual art. The documentary then immediately cuts to more nude performance art I can't show you on YouTube. Carolee Schneemann says that a goal of her work was to penetrate her culture with the female body and attributes of the female body. As I understand it, Schneemann is not just getting naked, she is trying to change the culture around her using her nude body to try and normalize her ideas about the nude female body. Because she was a painter, she combined tools and materials from her painting with her nude body.
So the body itself was subjected to the materials that I, as a painter, was using in the constructions. It was painted, it was greased, it was oiled, it was chalked, it was covered in ropes, it was collaged. They all said it was like a kind of pornography, and if I wanted to paint, I should paint.
Well, what was your response to their objection? Did you want to make paintings? B. Ruby Rich argues that feminists should have expected pushback for this sort of shocking use of nudity in art. Not just moral condemnation from men and women, but also being laughed at. I agree with Rich. She seems somewhat indignant about this response to the nude body in feminist art, but of course people laughed at them and continue to laugh at it today. It's funny for an academic feminist with a degree or a PhD to prance about naked as part of a feminist art statement about the objectification of the female body in the male gaze. You can't make this not funny. Rich's indignant comments about people objecting to this representation of female sexuality is juxtaposed with what appears to me to be a video by Schneemann depicting sexual activity. I'm not going to try to identify the genders in the clip because I'm already sad I had to see it once by accident. I changed my mind. Do not watch this movie. Even if you can watch it without giving these filmmakers a penny, watching this documentary is a sin. Stay away. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. What Rich is indignant about is the very idea that someone would object to this art. Given what Schneemann has said about wanting to penetrate the culture with her ideas about the body, it seems fair to conclude that Schneemann is deliberately embracing sexual imagery she knows will be shocking, that the shock aspect is a part of what she is striving for. Feminist artists are indignant when their deliberately shocking work, which is intended to change the culture and the politics of the day, receives any kind of political kickback or moral condemnation from the very culture they are seeking to penetrate. They are particularly indignant when this criticism comes from women or more old-fashioned feminists, because they want to portray themselves as the representatives of women artists, but they are not. Academic, avant-garde feminist artists are a very small subgroup of women artists who are using their influence and energy to tell a story. The narrative of this film is the idea that feminist artists are the representatives of women. It is at times like this that cracks begin to show in this narrative. Plenty of women who are entirely capable of thinking for themselves and coming to their own conclusions do not have to like this art, validate it, or support it financially if they do not want to. Avant-garde feminist art can't dress up its ideas and try to attract more people to their cause with honey rather than vinegar. Judy Chicago's anger and toxic behavior, which was briefly alluded to earlier in this documentary, is one symptom, one problem among many for academic feminist art, but it's not the sole problem. The entire worldview, the endgame, and the strategies employed by avant-garde feminist artists bring them into conflict with Western culture, and everyone who loves Western art, regardless of their race, sex, or orientation. This is the end of the section on the body in feminist art. We're not even halfway through this documentary, but I've concluded that this needs to be a two-parter, and pornographic feminist shock art is about as good a closer for a YouTube video as I've ever heard. I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys, and if you love me back, why not like, comment, subscribe, click the bell for notifications, and share this video with someone whose day you want to ruin. Go curse a timeline. I'll catch you later. The exclusion of black women artists from all shows because of their position as the only generation which is creating a revolution in meaning art of we are destroying the walls that separate the art of black women from the view of the people by exposing so-called black art shows as brown shit art shows and so-called protest shows as anti-human art superstar shows. We are revitalizing an interest in black. We are destroying the walls that separate the art of black women from the view. All shows which are not a stated projection of a particular cultural group, such as Afro-American, All shows which are not a stated production. Well, was there anything else you heard here that might have made it a little odd to include this show? Like rejection. Do these sound like the charming kind of people that you just can't wait to have? Do these sound like the kind of charming people that you just can't wait to have an art show with so they can tell your black art that the reason radical feminist performance art, that the reason she participated in. When you demand a quota based on sex and call people brown shit artists, you are demanding that your art should not be evaluated and progressive. You are transphobic. But I am a feminist. But you don't have a cock. Guess that wrecks my dialectic. You are transphobic. But I am a feminist. But you don't have a cock. I want to emphasize this. But a feminist